In 1933, one factory in Philadelphia controlled 30% of every radio sold in America. Walk into any home from Boston to Los Angeles, and there was a 1 in 3 chance you'd see that name glowing from a wooden cabinet: Philco. They built the mission control center that put men on the moon. They invented the first wireless remote control, the first telescoping car antenna, the transistor that made modern computers possible. At their peak, this company pulled in $300 million a year. That's over $5 billion in today's money, and employed thousands of workers in a sprawling industrial complex that covered entire city blocks. Then something went catastrophically wrong. By 1974, those same factory floors sat empty. The workers were gone. The machines were silent. And within 3 decades, the buildings themselves would be demolished, leaving nothing but rubble and memories. This is the story of how one Scottish immigrant turned a bankrupt light bulb company into the world's largest radio empire. How American innovation created an industrial giant that seemed unstoppable. And how that same giant made a series of decisions so disastrous that it collapsed in less than 15 years. This isn't just about old radios gathering dust in your grandparents' attic. This is about the price of losing focus, the danger of chasing too many dreams at once, and what happens when pride in yesterday's success blinds you to tomorrow's reality. Welcome inside the Philco Factory, where America's industrial dream was built and lost. Chapter 1. Dreamers and Disasters. Spring 1892. 3 men stood in a cramped workshop at 1310 Filbert Street in Philadelphia, staring at a piece of German engineering that was about to either make them rich or destroy them completely. Thomas Spencer, the older brother and electrical engineer, ran his fingers across the patent documents. His younger brother Frank studied the technical specifications, and Frank Marr, the man with the money, made a decision that would set everything in motion. They called themselves the Spencer Company, and they had one product: carbon arc lamps. If you've never seen a carbon arc lamp, imagine the brightest light you've ever experienced, then multiply it by 10. 2 carbon electrodes separated by an air gap, electric current jumping between them, creating an arc so brilliant it could light up entire city blocks. This was the cutting edge of urban illumination, powerful enough for train stations, factory floors, and street corners where gaslight just couldn't compete. The technology was German, licensed from the Helios Company, and it cost them nearly their entire $10,000 startup capital just to get the rights. But Thomas Spencer believed, his brother believed, and Marr's checkbook believed. So they renamed themselves Helios Electric Company, borrowing that prestigious German name to give themselves credibility they hadn't earned yet. Here's the problem with believing too hard in your product. The market doesn't care about your passion. In 1893, Electrical World magazine praised their engineering, called it innovative, sophisticated. The Spencer brothers must have felt vindicated until they checked the order book and found it empty. No customers, no sales, just glowing reviews that didn't pay the rent. By August of that year, they had to shut down for 2 weeks, not for maintenance, not for vacation. They closed because there was literally nothing to do, no orders to fill, no work to keep the lights on. Ironic for a lighting company. Thomas Spencer took over as factory manager while Marr handled the business side, desperately trying to find anyone, who wanted their lamps. They limped through the next 2 years on life support. Then, in 1895, something shifted. Maybe it was better marketing. Maybe cities were finally ready to invest in modern lighting. Whatever the reason, Helios Electric came roaring back. They boldly declared themselves the largest carbon arc lamp manufacturer in America. And technically, they might have been right, because the technology was still so new that there weren't many competitors to begin with. But here's the thing about being first to market with yesterday's technology. You're still selling yesterday's technology. While the Spencer brothers were perfecting carbon arc lamps, Thomas Edison's incandescent bulbs were quietly taking over the world. Cheaper, safer, easier to install. You didn't need an electrical engineer to change a light bulb, but you definitely needed one to maintain a carbon arc system. By the late 1890s, the writing was on the wall, and it was written in tungsten filament. The carbon arc market didn't just shrink, it collapsed. Cities that had considered their lamps started buying Edison bulbs instead. Factories opted for the simpler solution. By 1899, Helios Electric's sales had fallen to nearly zero. The company that had proclaimed itself the largest manufacturer in America was now the largest manufacturer of a product nobody wanted anymore. In 1904, bankruptcy assessors valued the company at 20 cents on the dollar. 20 cents. Every dollar invested was now worth a pair of dimes. Frank Marr watched his investment evaporate. The anonymous business partners whose names were never even recorded in company history had already disappeared. And in 1905, Thomas Spencer, the engineer who started it all, who believed in carbon arc technology with everything he had, walked away in disgust. The Helios Electric Company was dead. The dream was over. The factory at Filbert Street was essentially worthless. This is where most startup failure stories end. A few guys had a good idea, bet everything on it, and lost when the market moved on. We've all heard this story 1,000 times, except this time, the story didn't end. Because while Thomas Spencer was packing his things and walking out the door, someone else was already looking at the smoldering wreckage and seeing something different. Not a failed lighting company, not a cautionary tale, but raw materials for something entirely new. The first disaster was complete, but the dreamers weren't done yet. Chapter 2. The Battery Gamble. July 25th, 1906. This is the date that actually matters. Forget the Spencer brothers and their carbon arc dreams. That company died with Thomas walking out the door. What rose from those ashes was something completely different. The Philadelphia Storage Battery Company. New name, new product, new gamble. And this time, the bet was even riskier than before. Edward Davis, the company treasurer, looked at the automobile industry exploding across America and made a calculated decision. Electric cars and delivery trucks were flooding city streets, and every single one of them needed powerful storage batteries to run. Gasoline engines were gaining ground too, and they needed starting batteries. This wasn't a maybe. This wasn't a hope. This was a market with real demand, real customers, and real money. Davis convinced the remaining investors, Edward Yarnall, a man named Whitmer, and factory manager E. Earl Everett, to go all in. Abandon lighting completely. Build batteries instead. Their first office in 1907 tells you everything about how close to the edge they were operating. One desk, 2 chairs, a single typewriter. That was it. That was the entire corporate headquarters of what would become a $300 million empire. They bought a small manufacturing facility on Emerald and Tioga Streets just to get production started. But even Davis knew this was temporary. If this gamble paid off, they'd need real space. In 1909, they found it, a property at Ontario and C Streets in the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia, industrial area, working class, plenty of room to expand. They moved in, set up shop, and this address became home for the next 65 years, Ontario and C Streets. Remember that intersection? Because everything that follows, every triumph, every disaster, happens right there. The timing couldn't have been better. While electric vehicles were popular for city deliveries, gasoline-powered cars were starting to dominate for personal use. And gasoline engines had a problem. You needed a hand crank to start them. which was dangerous, exhausting, and occasionally broke someone's arm when the engine backfired. The solution? An electric starter motor powered by a storage battery. Philadelphia Storage Battery started manufacturing starting batteries in the 1910s. And suddenly they weren't just supplying delivery trucks. They were supplying every car company trying to make driving easier. Then World War I changed everything. The U.S. military needed batteries, lots of them. Vehicles, communication equipment, portable power supplies for field operations. Between 1914 and 1918, government contracts poured in, and Philadelphia Storage Battery went from a scrappy startup to a legitimate manufacturing operation with steady revenue and a growing workforce. War is hell, but it's profitable if you're making what the military needs. March 20th, 1920, 4:30 in the afternoon. Fire breaks out in the northwest corner of the factory complex at Ontario and C. Nobody knows how it started, but it spread fast. By the time the fire department got it under control, a significant portion of the facility was destroyed. Equipment gone, inventory gone, production capacity gone. Most companies would have shut down for weeks, maybe months, to rebuild. Not Philadelphia Storage Battery. 24 hours later, one day after the fire, workers erected a massive circus tent across the street and kept manufacturing batteries without missing a single delivery. That's not just resilience. That's obsession. That's a workforce that believed in what they were building and refused to let disaster stop them. That tent became legendary in company lore, a symbol of what happens when people are invested in more than just a paycheck. And investment was exactly what Edward Davis had in mind when Frank Marr died on December 1st, 1916. Davis took over as president and immediately implemented one of the most progressive management strategies of the era. He started buying stock from older executives and redistributing it to younger employees. The message was clear. If you work here, you own a piece of this. If you innovate, you profit. This wasn't charity, it was strategy. Davis understood that the next generation of engineers and workers would drive the company forward, but only if they had skin in the game. Give them ownership, and they'll give you innovation. It worked. By 1919, the company was thriving, and someone in marketing realized that Philadelphia Storage Battery Company was a mouthful. They needed something shorter, catchier, easier to remember. So they abbreviated it, Philco. The name appeared on battery labels in 1919. And customers loved it. Simple, clean, American. By 1920, annual sales hit $4 million, a staggering jump fueled by military contracts, consumer demand, and aggressive advertising. Davis had proven that the battery gamble wasn't just viable, it was wildly successful. But Davis was already looking ahead. In the late 1910s, a new market was emerging: home radios. Early radio sets were battery-powered, because most homes didn't have reliable electrical outlets yet. And those batteries needed to be recharged regularly. Philco was already making batteries. Why not make batteries specifically designed for radios? It seemed like a natural extension, a safe bet. Nobody at Philco realized they were about to stumble into the industry that would make them the biggest name in America, and eventually destroy them. Chapter 3. The Scotsman Who Saw Tomorrow. 2 weeks before graduation, May 1911. Most college seniors are celebrating, getting drunk, making plans to travel or sleep for a month. James M. Skinner took a job. $75 a month as an assistant manager at Philadelphia Storage Battery Company. Fresh out of the University of Pennsylvania, with a degree in chemical engineering, the kid could have gone anywhere. He chose a battery factory that most people had never heard of. Edward Davis hired him. And Skinner walked into that tiny office with the one desk and 2 chairs and got to work. This decision, this kid saying yes to a $75 paycheck, changed everything. But let's back up, because you need to understand who James Skinner actually was before you can understand what he built. Born February 9th, 1889, to Mortimer and Mary Skinner. Scottish immigrants who brought with them that particular brand of pragmatism that defines working-class Scotland. No nonsense, no waste. You work hard, you save your money, you take calculated risks, and you don't complain when things get tough. That was the Skinner household. James absorbed it all. At Penn, he wasn't just an engineering student. He was a lightweight boxer on the school team. Tough, competitive, used to taking hits and figuring out how to win anyway. He also had this weird knack for business that showed up early. The Priestley Club at Penn was drowning in debt, and Skinner, still a student, figured out how to save it. How? He sold ice cream to other students, not glamorous, not sophisticated, just profitable. Find what people want, sell it to them, use the money to solve the problem. That's the Skinner playbook in 3 steps. So when he graduated in 1911, and Edward Davis offered him a job, Skinner didn't see a struggling battery company. He saw an opportunity to learn everything: manufacturing, marketing, management, customer relations. He soaked it up like a sponge, working directly under Davis and watching how the president navigated the chaotic post-war market. By 1919, Skinner was 30 years old, and Davis promoted him to vice president and general manager. 8 years. That's how long it took him to go from entry-level assistant to running the entire operation. And the first thing he did in that role was launch an advertising blitz unlike anything Philadelphia Storage Battery had ever attempted. Up until then, they'd been selling business to business, supplying batteries to manufacturers and industrial clients. Skinner flipped the script. He took the Philco name that had been quietly appearing on labels and turned it into a consumer brand. Billboards, magazine ads, radio spots. He made Philco a household word before most people even knew what a household radio was. Then, 1921 hit, post-war recession, the economy tanked, sales dropped by $1 million almost overnight. Companies were folding left and right, but Skinner didn't panic. He did what Scots do. He got practical, cut costs, tightened operations, found efficiencies, and started looking for the next market before the current one disappeared completely. By 1923, he'd identified it: radio batteries for home use. Radios were becoming affordable enough that middle-class families could buy them. But the technology was still clunky. You needed 2 separate batteries to power one radio. The A battery ran at low voltage, 6 volts, but drew high current to heat up the filament inside the vacuum tubes. The B battery was the opposite: high voltage, 90 to 135 volts, but low current for the plate voltage that actually amplified the signal. Philco's competitors were selling dry cell batteries. Use them once, throw them away, buy new ones. Expensive, wasteful. Skinner saw an opening. Philco started manufacturing wet cell B batteries that could be recharged. Same performance, but customers saved money in the long run. Practical, Scottish, August 1925. Skinner launched the product that should have made Philco untouchable: the Socket Power Battery Eliminator. Imagine you're a radio owner in 1925. Every few weeks, your batteries die. You haul them to a shop, pay to get them recharged or buy new ones, haul them back home, hook them up again. It's a pain. Skinner's Socket Power eliminated the problem entirely. It was a rectifier, a device that converted alternating current from your wall outlet into the direct current your radio needed. Plug your radio into the wall, forget about batteries forever. The product was a sensation by 1927. Baldwin's. Philco had sold over 1 million Socket Power units. They weren't just a battery company anymore. They were the leading supplier of radio power systems in America. Skinner had done it again. Found the market, built the product, dominated the competition. Then RCA destroyed him. In 1927, RCA introduced AC-powered vacuum tubes. These tubes could run directly on alternating current from the wall socket without needing a rectifier. No socket power, no eliminator, no Philco middleman. Just plug the radio straight into the wall and it works. Within months, Skinner's million-selling product was obsolete. Completely, totally, worthless. This was the second time in Philco's history that a technological shift had nearly killed the company. First, Edison's light bulbs destroyed the carbon arc business. Now, RCA's AC tubes were about to destroy the socket power business. Skinner stood at Ontario and C Streets, looking at warehouses full of products nobody wanted anymore, and had to make a choice. He could do what Thomas Spencer did in 1905, walk away, admit defeat, let the company collapse. Or he could do what Edward Davis did in 1906, burn it all down and build something new. Skinner chose the latter. But this time, the gamble wasn't just big, it was insane. Chapter 4. The Assembly Line Miracle, 1926. James Skinner walked into a board meeting with a proposal so audacious that half the executives thought he'd lost his mind. Philco was going to stop making radio accessories and start making radios. Complete radios. Entire units, from chassis to cabinet. The reaction was immediate. We've never built a radio in our lives. There are already 800 radio manufacturers in America. We're a battery company. What the hell are you thinking? Skinner's answer was simple. If we don't do this, we're dead. Socket power is finished. RCA just killed it. We either pivot now or watch this company collapse for the second time. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to borrow $7 million, tear apart the Ontario factory, and build an assembly line that can manufacture radios faster and cheaper than anyone else in America. $7 million in 1926 is about $100 million today. Betting that kind of money on an industry you've never competed in? With 800 established rivals already fighting for market share. That's not bold. That's borderline suicidal. But Skinner had seen something nobody else understood yet. He'd watched Henry Ford revolutionize car manufacturing with assembly lines, standardized parts, interchangeable components, workers performing the same task over and over at lightning speed. Ford turned cars from luxury items into mass-market products, and Skinner realized radios were at the exact same inflection point. In 1926, radios were still handcrafted by skilled technicians. Every unit was slightly different. Production was slow, costs were high, quality was inconsistent. If you wanted a good radio, you paid a premium because craftsmanship was expensive. Skinner thought, what if we don't do it that way? What if we industrialize the whole process, standardize every component, build jigs and fixtures so anyone can assemble them? Train workers to do one task perfectly instead of requiring master craftsmen for everything. Cut production time by 90% and slash costs in half. That's not just making radios. That's reimagining how radios are made. The board approved the loan. Construction crews tore through the Ontario and C Streets complex, reconfiguring entire buildings into a flowing production system. Conveyor belts, workstations, quality control checkpoints, raw materials entered one end. Finished radios rolled out the other. It was the first assembly line ever built specifically for radio manufacturing, and when it fired up in mid-1928, it was unlike anything the industry had seen. Philco's first radio hit the market in the summer of 1928, and by the end of that year, they'd produced 96,000 units. 96,000. A company that had never made a single radio 12 months earlier just became the 26th largest radio manufacturer in America, out of 800 competitors in 1 year. That's not growth. That's a hostile takeover of an entire industry. Skinner's philosophy wasn't cheap radios for poor people. It was quality radios at affordable prices for the masses. That distinction matters. He didn't cut corners to lower costs. He eliminated inefficiency. Philco radios worked as well as anything Atwater Kent or Majestic built, but they cost less because the manufacturing process was smarter. In 1929, Philco released the Baby Grande cathedral-style radio with that distinctive Gothic arch cabinet design, beautiful, reliable, reasonably priced. It became iconic almost overnight, the radio that defined the American living room. Sales exploded by the end of 1929. Philco had rocketed to third place nationally, trailing only Atwater Kent and Majestic, two giants that had been dominating the market for years. Third place in 18 months, from zero. And Skinner had one more ace nobody saw coming. Remember all those battery dealers Philco had built relationships with throughout the 1910s? Every hardware store, every service shop, every distributor who'd been selling Philco batteries for a decade? They were still there, still loyal, still connected. When Philco pivoted to radios, they didn't have to build a distribution network from scratch. They just redirected the one they already had. Atwater Kent and Majestic were fighting to expand their dealer networks. Philco already had theirs in place, spanning every state and reaching international markets. They could ship radios anywhere, fast, because the infrastructure was already built. That's the advantage of pivoting instead of starting over. You bring your existing strengths with you, the factory at Ontario, and see expanded block by block. New buildings, new production lines. The workforce exploded from a few hundred to several thousand. They ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because demand was outpacing supply. The assembly line let them build radios 10 times faster than traditional methods while maintaining consistent quality. Costs dropped by half, but performance stayed high. Competitors couldn't figure out how Philco was doing it. They assumed corner cutting. They assumed inferior components. They were wrong. Philco had simply recognized that how you make something matters as much as what you make. Process innovation, not just product innovation. Ford understood that with cars. Skinner understood it with radios. And the market rewarded both of them the same way: total domination. Chapter 5. The Radio Empire Peaks, 1930. Philco became the #1 radio manufacturer in the world. Not in Philadelphia, not in America, in the world. 600,000 radios sold in a single year. Revenue hit $34 million, more money than most people could comprehend in the middle of the Depression. While banks were failing and factories were shutting down, Philco was running at full capacity, unable to keep up with demand. By 1934, they owned 30% of the entire American radio market. 1 out of every 3 radios sold in the United States had Philco stamped on it. That's not market share. That's market control. Atwater Kent, Majestic RCA. Everyone else was fighting over the remaining 70% while Philco stood alone at the top. The secret wasn't cheaper radios. It was better value. Skinner had proven you could mass produce without sacrificing quality, and Philco's product lineup reflected that philosophy at every price point. Need a basic radio for the kitchen? Philco sold a 5-tube model that worked perfectly and didn't cost a month's salary. Want something for the living room that impressed your neighbors? Philco offered 20-tube hi-fi consoles in hand-finished wooden cabinets that sounded as good as anything on the market and looked like furniture, not electronics. Rich or poor, urban or rural. Philco had a radio designed for your life and your budget. That range, from affordable to luxurious, meant they competed in every segment simultaneously, while most manufacturers picked one lane and stayed in it. In 1934, Philco engineers solved a problem nobody else had figured out: car radio antennas. Up until then, if you wanted a radio in your automobile, you had to mount a long metal antenna on the running board or fender. It looked ridiculous, caught on things, and was a pain to deal with. Philco invented the telescoping antenna, a retractable design that could extend when you needed it and collapse when you didn't. Simple, elegant, obvious in hindsight, revolutionary at the time. That same year, Philco signed an exclusive contract with Ford Motor Company to supply radios for all Ford vehicles. Exclusive. That meant if you bought a Ford and wanted a factory radio, it was a Philco, no other options. The contract lasted decades and generated massive stable revenue year after year. It also meant Philco radios were in millions of cars, reinforcing brand recognition every time someone turned the ignition. But Philco wasn't just chasing the wealthy urban market. Rural America in the 1930s was a different world. Thousands of farms and small towns with no electrical infrastructure. No power lines meant no wall outlets, which meant standard AC radios were useless. Most manufacturers ignored this market because it was fragmented and logistically complicated. Philco saw an opportunity. They built battery-powered farm radios that performed identically to their electric models. Same quality, same features, just powered by batteries instead of the grid. For the first time, a farmer in Iowa could listen to the same radio programs as someone in New York City. Philco made that possible. And rural customers remained fiercely loyal to the brand for decades because of it. By 1937 and 1938, Philco was pushing into the premium audio market with massive 20-tube console models that competed directly with high-end phonographs. These weren't just radios. They were entertainment centers with exceptional sound quality, housed in beautifully crafted wooden cabinets that looked at home in wealthy living rooms. The goal was to position Philco as the definitive name in home audio, not just affordable radios. Meanwhile, Philco was also experimenting with the future. In 1932, they established experimental television station W3XE in Philadelphia, making them one of the earliest pioneers in TV broadcasting. They were testing, learning, preparing for the next technological wave while still dominating the current one. And then there was mystery control. In 1936, Philco introduced the first wireless remote control for radios. You could change between 8 preset stations, adjust the volume, and turn the radio off, all from across the room using a small handheld device that transmitted low-frequency radio signals. It couldn't turn the radio on remotely. You still had to do that manually. But everything else? Pure magic for 1936. Philco marketed it as a mysterious force, controlling your radio, leaning into the sci-fi appeal rather than trying to explain the technical details. Customers loved it. Engineers loved it. The only problem was the rubber-insulated wiring, which would degrade and fail after 70 years, but that's a problem for future collectors, not 1936 buyers. By 1938, Philco stood at the absolute peak of its power. The most trusted radio brand in America. Ontario and C Streets had grown into one of the largest electronics manufacturing complexes in the world, employing thousands of workers churning out millions of radios annually. If you walked into any American home in 1938, there was a 30% chance you'd see a Philco radio sitting in the living room. The company had survived 2 near-death experiences, bet everything on a manufacturing revolution, and won so decisively that they redefined the entire industry. James Skinner had taken a struggling battery company and turned it into an empire. This was the moment, the peak. The golden age when everything Philco touched seemed to succeed. But empires don't stay at the top forever. And the decisions made at the peak, when success feels permanent and invincibility feels earned, those are the decisions that determine what comes next. Chapter 6. The Diversification Trap. James Buckley. A senior Philco executive noticed a problem. Radio sales were seasonal. They spiked from summer through Christmas as families bought sets for the holiday season, then dropped off sharply in January and stayed sluggish through spring. The factories ran hot for 6 months, then sat underutilized for the other 6. Buckley proposed a solution he called filling the business cycle. Add product lines that sold well during radio's slow months to smooth out revenue year-round. On paper, it made perfect sense. In practice, it was the beginning of the end. In 1938, Philco entered the home air conditioning market, new product. Growing industry seemed like a natural fit for a company that understood consumer electronics. In 1939, they added refrigerators, appliances that sold best in spring and summer, exactly when radio sales slumped. The logic was sound. When one division slowed down, another would pick up the slack, keep the factories busy, keep the revenue flowing. In 1940, Philco officially changed its name to Philco Corporation, dropping any reference to batteries or storage. The message was clear. We're not a radio company anymore. We're a diversified conglomerate building whatever American families need. Then World War II hit, and everything stopped. From 1941 to 1945, Philco converted entirely to military production, radios for the armed forces, radar systems, communication equipment. The factories ran around the clock, 7 days a week, pumping out hardware for the war effort. It was profitable, patriotic, and kept the workforce employed. But it also delayed the inevitable reckoning with diversification because the government contracts papered over any strategic cracks. When the war ended in 1945, Philco expanded aggressively. They built a new radio phonograph plant at the southwest corner of Ontario and preparing for the post-war consumer boom. Everyone who delayed buying during the war years was about to open their wallets, and Philco wanted to capture every dollar. In 1946, they launched freezers. In 1947, they pioneered color television for consumers, investing heavily in R&D years before the market was ready. In 1948, they introduced miniature tubes and search-tune radios for cars, plus the Model 48-1000, Philco's first commercial television with a tiny 7-inch screen that cost $375, equivalent to nearly $5,000 today. By 1953, Philco had sold 1 million TVs, making them a major player in the television market. But RCA owned that space. RCA was to television what Philco had been to radios in the 1930s, dominant, focused, and pulling further ahead every year. Philco was competing, but not winning. That same year, 1953, Philco engineers developed the surface barrier transistor, the first high-frequency transistor suitable for computers, cutting-edge technology, genuinely innovative. Also insanely expensive to research and manufacture. In 1954, Philco added washing machines and dryers, putting them in direct competition with Whirlpool, General Electric, and Westinghouse, companies that had been building appliances for decades. That same year, Philco also built the first all-transistor car radio, a technological breakthrough that eliminated hot, bulky vacuum tubes. In 1955, they opened a factory in Sandusky, Ohio, to produce the Chrysler Mopar 914HR transistor radio. Philco engineers even contributed to the NTSC standard, the National Television System Committee, that defined how color TV would work in America. On the surface, this looked like innovation, diversification, growth. Philco was everywhere. Radios, televisions, refrigerators, freezers, air conditioners, washing machines, dryers, transistors, computers, defense contracts. They were doing everything. And that was the problem. Every single one of those product lines required its own research and development team, its own manufacturing process, its own supply chain, its own marketing strategy, its own distribution network. Radios needed engineers who understood audio. TVs needed engineers who understood video and broadcasting. Appliances needed engineers who understood motors and compressors. Transistors needed physicists and materials scientists. Defense contracts needed security clearances and military liaisons. Each division was basically its own company, except they were all competing for the same pool of capital, attention, and executive bandwidth. Operating costs exploded. R&D budgets fragmented across a dozen initiatives instead of focusing on one or two. Marketing dollars spread thin trying to promote everything at once. Philco wasn't dominating any single category anymore. They were present in all of them, but leading in none. RCA owned television. Whirlpool owned appliances. IBM and other specialists were moving faster in computers. Meanwhile, Japanese manufacturers were entering the American market with radios and TVs that cost less and worked just as well. Philco had built an empire by focusing ruthlessly on one thing, radios, and doing it better than anyone else. Now they were trying to be good at 10 things simultaneously, and the math didn't work. You can't be the best at everything. You can barely be the best at one thing. Trying to excel in radios, TVs, appliances, transistors, and defense contracts simultaneously meant Philco was stretched impossibly thin, bleeding money in markets where they were outmatched, and losing focus on the core business that built the empire in the first place. By the mid-1950s, the cracks were visible to anyone paying attention. Revenue was still strong, but profitability was eroding. The company that once did one thing brilliantly was now doing many things adequately. And in business, adequacy doesn't sustain empires. Chapter 7. The Predicta Warning. 1957. Philco unveiled the Predicta television for the 1958 model year, and it looked like nothing anyone had ever seen. The picture tube sat in a swiveling pod mounted on a separate base, letting you rotate the screen to watch from different angles around the room. Futuristic, bold, weird. It came in multiple configurations, 17-inch or 21-inch screens, wood cabinets or metal tabletop models or floor consoles, some with rare UHF tuners for the handful of UHF stations that existed. The design goal was ambitious: create a shallower front-to-back profile by using a high-deflection angle cathode ray tube. Traditional CRTs were deep and boxy because the electron gun needed distance to sweep across the phosphor screen. Philco's high-deflection tube bent the electron beam at sharper angles, allowing a thinner cabinet. Visually, it was stunning. Technically, it was a disaster. The high-deflection angle picture tubes were catastrophically unreliable. Most of the 21-inch CRTs failed within the first year under warranty. Not some, not many, most. Philco had to replace them for free, absorbing the entire cost, and replacing a CRT wasn't like swapping out a light bulb. It required sending a technician to the customer's home, disassembling the television, carefully removing the failed tube, installing a new one, reassembling everything and testing it. Labor-intensive, expensive, time-consuming. Warranty costs spiraled out of control. Dealers started complaining because every Predicta they sold turned into a service nightmare. Customers who'd trusted the Philco name felt betrayed when their expensive new television died within months. The press noticed, reviews turned negative, word spread. Philco's reputation, built over decades of reliable radios, took a serious hit. Ironically, the Predicta sold reasonably well in motels and bars. The swiveling screen was actually useful when you needed multiple people sitting at different angles to see the same TV. But the residential market? Brutal. Philco kept producing Predictas through 1959, releasing new console and tabletop models while trying to fix the CRT reliability issues. They couldn't. By 1960, they stopped production entirely, effectively admitting failure. The Predicta became a cautionary tale, beautiful design undone by engineering shortcuts and inadequate testing. And here's the historical irony. Today, the Predicta is a collector's favorite. The iconic design, the space-age aesthetic, the rarity. Restored Predictors command high prices from enthusiasts who love the look and don't care that the original tubes were garbage. But in 1960, it was a disaster that damaged Philco's credibility right when they needed it most. Now, here's the part people misunderstand. The Predicta didn't kill Philco. It revealed the cracks that were already there. In 1950, Philco's annual sales exceeded $300 million. By 1960, profitability had collapsed to just $2.3 million. That's not a typo. Revenue was still substantial. But profit margins had evaporated. The Predicta contributed to that decline, sure. Warranty costs bled money and hurt the brand. But the real problems ran much deeper. Philco's computer division, the Philco 2000 series, was hemorrhaging cash, cutting-edge technology, but insanely expensive to develop and manufacture with razor-thin margins. Defense contracts sounded prestigious, but they came with high costs, low profits, and enormous risks. If you missed a deadline or a spec, the penalties could wipe out any gains. The appliance divisions, refrigerators, freezers, washing machines, dryers, ranges, were expanding too fast. Each product line needed its own factory, its own supply chain, its own distribution network. Philco was competing against companies like Whirlpool and GE that had spent decades perfecting appliance manufacturing. Philco was the newcomer, trying to catch up while simultaneously fighting battles in radios, TVs, transistors, and computers. The marketing budget was scattered across too many products. There was no focus, no central message. RCA, meanwhile, had zeroed in on television and was dominating the market with relentless focus and massive R&D investment. Japanese manufacturers, Sony, Panasonic, others, were entering the American market with cheap, reliable radios and TVs that undercut Philco's pricing while matching or exceeding quality. Philco had lost what made them great in the first place: focus. In the 1930s, they built radios and only radios, and they built them better and cheaper than anyone else. By 1960, they were trying to build radios, TVs, refrigerators, freezers, air conditioners, washing machines, dryers, transistors, computers, and military hardware all at the same time. Each division was underfunded relative to the competition. Each division was under-resourced. None of them had the capital or attention needed to truly dominate. Philco was overextended, underfunded in every category and losing ground across the board. The Predicta was the symptom, not the disease. It was the visible failure that symbolized the invisible rot, a company that had spread itself too thin, chased too many markets, and forgotten that excellence requires concentration. By the end of 1960, Philco was still standing, still operating, still selling products, but they were no longer leading. The empire that James Skinner built by betting everything on one brilliant idea, the assembly line for radios, had diluted itself into mediocrity by trying to be everything to everyone. And mediocrity, as it turns out, is just a slower way to fail. Chapter 8: Ford's Strategic Move, December 11th, 1961. Ford Motor Company acquired Philco for approximately $100 million. Before we go any further, let's kill a myth that's persisted for decades. This was not a rescue mission. This was not Henry Ford II playing white knight swooping in to save a dying company from bankruptcy court. That's the story people tell because it's simple and dramatic. But it's wrong. Philco in 1961 was hurting. Yes, profitability had cratered. Diversification had failed. The Predicta disaster was still fresh in everyone's memory, but Philco was still a substantial operation. They had factories across multiple states, they had valuable patents and cutting-edge technology. They had contracts with NASA and the Department of Defense. They had a customer base and brand recognition that meant something. Wall Street looked at Philco and saw a mess. Ford looked at Philco and saw assets worth $100 million. Why did Ford want them? Let's start with the obvious: transistors and semiconductors. The automotive industry in the early 1960s was becoming increasingly electronic. Car radios were standard equipment now. not luxury options. But beyond entertainment, Ford was looking ahead to computerized engine management, electronic ignition systems, digital dashboards, all the technology that would define cars in the coming decades. They needed a reliable supply of high-quality transistors and semiconductors. And Philco's technology was genuinely world-class. Buying Philco meant Ford could vertically integrate their electronic supply chain instead of relying on outside vendors who might prioritize other customers or raise prices whenever they felt like it. Control the supply, control the costs, control the future. The defense contracts were equally important. Ford wanted to diversify beyond automobiles into aerospace and military systems, but breaking into that world from scratch was nearly impossible. You needed security clearances. You needed established relationships with the Pentagon and NASA. You needed engineers who understood classified work and facilities that met government standards. Philco had all of that already. They'd been doing defense work for years. Ford could buy their way into an industry that would have taken a decade to enter organically. And there was history here too. Philco had been supplying car radios to Ford since the 1930s. This wasn't a blind acquisition of some random company. Ford knew Philco's capabilities intimately. They'd worked together for 30 years. Ford understood what Philco could do when properly managed and adequately funded, and they believed they could turn it around. So they wrote the check. Philco survived. But it had lost the future. Ford was betting they could give it back. For a while, that bet looked brilliant, at least on the aerospace side. In 1960, before Ford even owned them, Philco's Western Development Labs had launched Courier 1B, the world's first active repeater communication satellite. This wasn't just a passive reflector bouncing signals back to Earth. Courier 1B actively received, amplified, and retransmitted signals, making long-distance communication dramatically more reliable. It was a proof of concept that paved the way for every communications satellite that followed. That same year, NASA signed a contract with Philco to build the global tracking station network for Project Mercury, America's first attempt to put human beings into space. Those tracking stations weren't just for Mercury, they kept operating through Gemini, through Apollo, through Skylab, all the way into the 1990s. Only when NASA deployed the TDRS satellite constellation, tracking and data relay satellites that could monitor spacecraft from orbit instead of requiring ground stations scattered across the planet, did Philco's network finally become obsolete. But the crown jewel, the achievement that overshadows everything else Philco ever built, came in 1963. NASA contracted Philco to design and construct mission control in Houston. Not just the room, not just the consoles, the entire integrated system, computers, displays, communication links, data processing infrastructure. Mission control had to handle 1,500 different data streams simultaneously. Astronaut heart rates, cabin pressure, fuel levels, trajectory calculations, communications from spacecraft, tracking stations, recovery ships. Everything flowing into one room where flight controllers made split-second decisions that determined whether people lived or died. Philco built that system. When Gemini astronauts orbited Earth, mission control tracked them. When Apollo 11 descended toward the lunar surface and Neil Armstrong's heart rate spiked to over 150 beats per minute, mission control monitored every second. When he stepped onto the moon and said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," the room coordinating that moment, the consoles, the computers, the screens, the infrastructure that made human spaceflight possible, all of it was designed and installed by Philco. That's the greatest technological legacy this company ever produced. Nothing else even comes close. Meanwhile, back on Earth, consumer products continued under the Philco Ford banner. In 1963, they were selling AM radios and AM units with built-in 8-track tape players, capitalizing on the 8-track format that was becoming popular for car audio. In 1966, the company officially changed its name to Philco Ford Corporation, cementing the merger in branding as well as ownership. That same year, they introduced AM/FM radios with push-button search tuning. You could press a button and the radio would automatically scan for the next strong signal. A convenience feature that seems trivial now, but felt futuristic in 1966. The 1966 and 1967 console stereo systems represented the peak of Philco Ford's consumer audio ambitions. These weren't cheap plastic boxes. They were furniture-quality wooden cabinets housing powerful 100-watt and 300-watt chassis, marketed under the Mastercraft label to compete directly with Magnavox in the premium home audio market. By 1968, AM/FM stereo was standard, and by 1973, they were selling integrated systems with AM/FM stereo and 8-track playback all in one unit. But here's the problem. Philco Ford was still making everything. Color TVs, black and white TVs, refrigerators, washing machines, dryers, air conditioners, kitchen ranges, portable transistor radios, portable phonographs. The product catalog hadn't shrunk under Ford's ownership. If anything, it had expanded. Ford poured tens of millions of dollars into modernizing the facilities, upgrading equipment, and trying to restore profitability. But the fundamental strategic error remained unchanged. Philco Ford was competing in a dozen different markets simultaneously, and in every single one, they were up against specialists who'd been perfecting their craft for decades. RCA owned television. Whirlpool owned appliances. Sony and Panasonic were flooding the market with cheap, reliable electronics. Philco Ford wasn't winning anywhere. In October 1973, the company launched a campaign called Philco is Here to Stay. It was part public relations, part reassurance to dealers and customers, part internal morale boost. President Thomas Page and a delegation of Ford executives embarked on an ambitious 10,000-mile tour across 2 continents, visiting 4.1 million square feet of manufacturing space. They stopped at every major facility: Lansdale, Pennsylvania, where they made electronics and semiconductors; Watsontown, Pennsylvania, where skilled craftsmen built wooden cabinets; Connorsville, Indiana, where appliances rolled off assembly lines; and the Brazil plant, where they manufactured car radios and television modules for international markets. The message was clear and emphatic. Ford is committed. The factories are running. The products are good. We're investing. We're modernizing. We're not going anywhere. Philco is here to stay. The optimism lasted about 3 months. Then the recession hit, and reality came crashing down. Chapter 9. The Final Collapse. Late 1973. The Philco is Here to Stay tour had barely wrapped up when the problems started piling on faster than anyone could manage. Product recalls, some publicly announced, others handled quietly, drained resources, and damaged what remained of consumer confidence. The broader consumer electronics market was weakening, squeezed by cheaper imports and shifting consumer preferences. Then the 1973 to 1974 recession hit, one of the worst economic downturns since the Great Depression. Philco Ford was losing money consistently, with no turnaround in sight. Ford's executives looked at the numbers and made a cold calculation. Consumer electronics wasn't worth saving. The new strategy was brutal and efficient. Shift module production to Brazil to take advantage of import duty credits, scale back domestic manufacturing, focus corporate resources on defense and aerospace, where profit margins were healthier, and Philco Ford had genuine competitive advantages. That meant shutting down the consumer product factories that had employed thousands. Lansdale, Pennsylvania, gone. Watsontown, Pennsylvania, gone. Connorsville, Indiana, gone. In October 1974, less than a year after declaring Philco is here to stay, Ford sold the entire consumer electronics division to GTE Sylvania. Television production stopped immediately. Thousands of workers lost their jobs. The Philco name would survive on some products under new ownership, but the company that had dominated American radio manufacturing for decades was effectively dead. What remained of Philco scattered like shrapnel. In December 1975, the audio engineering group from Lansdale relocated to Bluebell, Pennsylvania. By spring 1978, they'd moved again to Willow Grove, a northern Philadelphia suburb. In August 1980, the car radio engineering team was absorbed into Ford's electrical and electronics division and relocated to Dearborn, Michigan, Ford's headquarters, 2 states away from where Philco had started. By 1989, even that group had moved to the Regent Court building in Dearborn. The people who'd once built radios at Ontario and C Streets were now corporate engineers in a completely different city, working for a completely different kind of company. The aerospace division, the one bright spot in Philco's final years, went through its own identity crisis. In the late 1970s, it was rebranded multiple times: Aero Neutronic Ford, then Ford Aerospace and Communications Corporation, then Ford Electronics and Refrigeration Corporation. The name kept changing because Ford kept trying to figure out what to do with this high-tech division that didn't fit neatly into an automotive company's structure. Eventually, Ford would sell that off too. But not before it had contributed to dozens of NASA missions and military projects. The aerospace engineers who'd built Mission Control had outlasted the consumer product workers by decades. But even they eventually found themselves working for someone else. In September 1994, Scotsman, the Lansdale factory was demolished. The physical plant that had manufactured semiconductors and electronics for decades was torn down, with operations moved 2 miles away to a different facility. But the real heartbreak was Ontario and C Streets. In 1974, the main factory complex, the place where millions of radios had been assembled, where Skinner's assembly line revolution had transformed American manufacturing, closed permanently. The buildings sat empty. No more workers, no more production lines, no more radios. By early 1998, the 1945 radio phonograph plant at the southwest corner of Ontario and C was still standing, a relic of the post-war boom. By the end of that year, it had been demolished. By 2002, the entire Philco complex had been reduced to fragments of first-floor tile scattered across vacant lots. A manufacturing campus that once sprawled across multiple city blocks in Kensington was gone. Only one structure remained, Building 14. The old cabinet manufacturing facility. Everything else, every factory, every warehouse, every office, erased. Kensington, the neighborhood where thousands of Philco workers had clocked in every day for over 60 years, became a symbol of American manufacturing decline. The jobs vanished. The buildings crumbled. The community that had been built around those paychecks struggled to survive. Drive through Kensington today, and you'll find empty lots where the Philco empire once stood. The workers are gone. The machines are gone. The company is gone. All that remains are memories. A few collectors' radios and a handful of people old enough to remember when Ontario and C Streets meant something. Chapter 10. Legacy and Lessons. The Philco name didn't die in 1974, it just scattered into pieces and reassembled under different ownership. GTE Sylvania held the consumer division from 1974 to 1981, then sold it to Philips, the Dutch electronics giant. By 1987, Philco had become a Philips subsidiary. In North America, Philco-branded products were Philips products wearing an old American name. In other markets, Philco International became part of Electrolux. The Western development labs that built satellites and mission control, that became Space Systems Laurel. continuing to manufacture spacecraft for NASA and other programs long after the radio factories had closed. For a while, you could find cheap Philco TVs and boomboxes at Kmart, nostalgia branding slapped on budget electronics. Polyconcept USA sold retro-styled Philco record players for a bit, but those disappeared too. Philco International morphed into Nordyne Corporation, exporting appliances under the old name. And ironically, in South America, Philco remains strong. There's still a factory in Manaus, Brazil, deep in the Amazon, producing electronics under a brand that barely exists in its country of origin. Here's the strangest twist. Those early Philco vacuum tubes? Manufactured by Sylvania. The company that would eventually own Philco's consumer division had been making components for Philco since the beginning, full circle. But forget the brand licensing and corporate reshuffling. Let's talk about what actually matters, the lessons. Because Philco's rise and collapse teaches us 4 things that companies are still getting wrong today. Lesson 1. Innovation without reliability equals disaster. The Predicta had a revolutionary design. Gorgeous, futuristic, completely unreliable. Those high-deflection tubes looked incredible until they failed, which most of them did within a year. Warranty costs destroyed profitability. Customer trust evaporated. Dealers refused to sell them. One bad product can obliterate decades of reputation. The takeaway? Never ship something that isn't ready. Building a brand takes years. Destroying it takes one defective product launch. Innovation is worthless if it doesn't work consistently. Lesson 2. Focus beats diversification. In the 1950s, Philco tried to do everything. Radios, televisions, refrigerators, freezers, air conditioners, washing machines, dryers, transistors, computers, defense contracts. Each category required its own research, its own marketing, its own expertise. Meanwhile, RCA focused on television and dominated. Sony focused on transistor radios and owned that market. Philco spread itself so thin that it wasn't excellent at anything. Better to dominate one market than be mediocre in 10. Diversification without dominance just means you're bleeding money in multiple directions simultaneously. Focus your resources where you can actually win. Lesson 3. Process innovation creates empires. In 1928, Philco went from nowhere to number 1 in the world within 2 years. Not because they invented better radios, because they figured out how to make radios faster and cheaper than anyone else. The assembly line was the innovation. How you make something matters as much as what you make. Ford understood this with cars. Skinner understood this with radios. Ironically, Ford later bought Philco using the same manufacturing philosophy Philco had borrowed from Ford decades earlier. Process innovation can reshape entire industries. Manufacturing excellence becomes a competitive moat that's nearly impossible to breach. Lesson 4. Timing beats pride. In 1926, Philco's socket power was the market leader. By 1927, RCA's AC tubes made it obsolete overnight. Skinner pivoted immediately to building complete radios, and Philco survived. But in the 1950s, Philco got slow. They were proud of their radio legacy, proud of their appliance lines, and they missed the transistor revolution and the shift to color television. RCA, Sony, and Japanese manufacturers moved faster. Pride in past success became the enemy of future survival. When the market shifts, you need to shift faster. Yesterday's dominance guarantees nothing about tomorrow. Now look at the numbers. $10,000 in startup capital in 1892. $300 million in annual sales by 1950. Profitability collapsed to $2.3 million by 1960. Sold to Ford for $100 million in 1961. Factories closed by 1974. The rise took 58 years. The peak lasted about 20. The decline took 14. Ontario and C Streets operated for 65 years, from 18 employees in 1907 to thousands in the 1950s to zero in 1974. Philco is the American manufacturing story in miniature. Built by immigrants, James Skinner, son of Scottish parents, who turned scrappiness and pragmatism into an empire. Powered by innovation, the assembly line that changed everything. Killed by complacency, 1950s overconfidence that diversification in size alone guaranteed survival. What's left? The pioneering spirit lives on in Space Systems, Laurel. Mission Control in Houston, Philco's greatest achievement, still represents human spaceflight, even though the company that built it is gone. Collectors treasure Predictas despite their flaws because the design was genuinely visionary, and in Brazil, the Philco name still means something. The factory is gone. The lessons remain, but are we listening? How many companies today are making the same mistakes Philco made in the 1950s? Chasing growth through unfocused diversification, spreading resources too thin, losing sight of what made them great. Innovation got Philco to number one, but innovation alone couldn't keep them there. Excellence requires focus. Survival requires humility. And empires collapse the moment they forget what built them in the first place.